Audrey? She builds sheds for a living. Just manual labor, Evelyn announced, across the table at Liam's engagement dinner. Arthur offered a cold, agreeing nod. I didn't flinch. I just sipped my water. Across the table, Margaret Vance, the billionaire developer hosting this event, suddenly dropped her silver fork against the china. She stared at me, eyes wide. Wait, I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 28 years. Growing up in Charleston, love was a strict contract, and I was perpetually in breach. Evelyn and Arthur treated my passion for architectural carpentry with a quiet, sanitized disgust, while they lavished praise and financial backing on Liam's corporate finance career, treating his every mediocre milestone as a blue-chip stock. My achievements were written off as bad debt. Woodworking was menial, blue-collar, beneath the Telfair name. People often ask why victims of subtle, chronic invalidation stay silent for so long. They wonder why we don't just scream, why we don't flip the table and demand our worth. But a toxic family doesn't build a prison out of iron bars. They build it out of invisible threads of obligation and normalized disrespect. It is a psychological ledger where you are always in the red. When you are systematically gaslit into believing your true self is an embarrassment, silence becomes a survival mechanism. You don't fight back because you've been conditioned to believe your voice has zero market value. You accept the marginalization because it's the only currency of connection they offer. It is the invisible chain of the survivor, keeping you tethered to a narrative that slowly erodes your identity. So, I didn't scream. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. I audited my life, cut my emotional losses, and channeled everything into the wood. 7 years ago, I founded Aegis Timberworks out of a drafty, uninsulated shed on the edge of town. I started with nothing but a vintage brass plumb bob and my grandmother Nana Clara's hand-carved cherrywood box. Nana Clara was my only steadfast anchor, the one person who saw my craft as art, not labor. In that freezing shed, I didn't summon regret or self-pity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I mapped out business plans on scrap lumber. I took on the historic timber frame restoration jobs that no one else had the patience or precision to execute. I studied load-bearing structural integrity, working 18-hour days, turning a one-woman operation into a fully scaled enterprise. While Evelyn and Arthur were busy polishing Liam's corporate resume for their country club friends, I was quietly acquiring historic preservation contracts across the eastern seaboard. I scaled Aegis Timberworks with ruthless efficiency. I didn't ask for their validation, and I certainly never asked for their capital. I operated in absolute silence, letting my work speak for itself. Today, Aegis is a $36 million historical restoration firm. But to my parents, I was still just the girl covered in sawdust, the unrefined daughter who built sheds. I let them keep their narrative. I paid my subscription to their family facade by showing up to dinners like this one, sitting quietly while they diminished me. They were completely unaware that the daughter they viewed as a social liability had surpassed their wildest financial dreams. I had simply stopped playing along with their currency and built an empire out of the very materials they despised. I excused myself from the table, needing a moment of quiet away from the clinking crystal and hollow laughter. As I stood up and pushed my chair back, my gaze fell upon Liam's phone, left resting on the crisp white tablecloth. The screen was glowing, brightly displaying a string of messages. My eyes caught my own name. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look away. I simply read the banner of the family group chat, time-stamped hours before this dinner even began. It was a text from Evelyn. Whatever you do, don't let Audrey talk about her restoration contracts. The Vances cannot know our family has a rough carpenter beneath us. Change the subject immediately if she brings up her sheds. Liam had replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. Arthur had added, Understood. We will control the narrative. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. They weren't just casually dismissive. This was a calculated, premeditated conspiracy to erase my professional existence. I stared at the glowing text, feeling my pulse remain perfectly steady. This is the cruel trap of narcissistic normalization. Toxic families do not merely ignore a child's achievements, they actively and systematically sanitize them. When a child builds an identity outside the family's approved script, it threatens their fragile hierarchy. To maintain their illusion of superiority, the parents must degrade the outlier's success into something menial. They rebrand a thriving business as a hobby. They label master craftsmanship as rough labor. They normalize this cruelty so completely that the scapegoat's erasure becomes standard operating procedure. It is a methodical campaign of identity theft, designed to keep the independent child small, manageable, and perpetually beneath them, ensuring the golden child's artificial shine is never threatened. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just processed the data. My family hadn't been acting out of ignorance. They had been acting out of malice. They knew I had contracts. They knew I ran a business. They simply refused to acknowledge its scale, reducing my entire life's work to sheds in order to protect their delicate social standing in front of the Vances. The revelation wasn't a wound. It was the final signature on a termination clause. I had spent years quietly accepting my role as the black sheep, assuming their disdain was just a byproduct of their traditionalist worldview. Now, I realized it had been a deliberate subscription to my humiliation, with me footing the emotional bill. I stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the dining room, smoothing the fabric of my dress. The anger inside me wasn't chaotic or fiery. It was cold, methodical, and impeccably organized. My family wanted to play a game of appearances, to manipulate the truth, to secure their standing with the billionaire developers hosting this dinner. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had underestimated the master carpenter they so eagerly despised. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. Every step I took back toward the table was deliberate and measured. The ledger was open, and the time for balancing the books had officially arrived. I returned to my seat at the table with quiet, absolute resolve. I pulled my chair in, my posture perfectly straight, refusing to shrink into the invisible corner my parents had designated for me. The conversation had shifted to the real estate market, a topic Arthur and Liam were loudly dominating to impress our hosts. Robert Vance, Margaret's husband and co-chair of their massive development empire, swirled the wine in his glass and politely turned his attention to me. "So, Audrey," Robert asked casually, a polite smile on his face, "we've heard all about Liam's corporate finance promotions. But what exactly is it that you do for a living?" Before I could even open my mouth, Evelyn jumped in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She waved her hand in that familiar, dismissive gesture. "Oh, Robert, you know how some young women are. Audrey is our free spirit. She likes working with her hands. She's a common laborer, really. She builds, sheds, and does odd carpentry jobs. It keeps her busy, bless her heart." Liam chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Someone has to swing the hammers, right?" Arthur offered another one of his cold, affirming nods. "We've tried to encourage her toward a more professional path, but she insists on the rough work." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for me. It was clinical. I analyzed their panic, watching them frantically execute the containment strategy I had just read on Liam's phone. But the dynamic shifted instantly. Margaret Vance raised her hand, silencing Evelyn with absolute billionaire-tier authority. The temperature at the table dropped. "Evelyn." "Please," Margaret said, her voice sharp and uncompromising. "I did not ask you. I want to hear it directly from Audrey." Margaret turned her piercing gaze to me. Her expression held no pity, only intense professional curiosity. The entire table froze. Evelyn's artificial smile cracked, and Arthur shifted uneasily in his seat. The power dynamic in the room inverted in a fraction of a second. I looked directly at Robert, bypassing my family entirely. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of emotion. "I do not build sheds," I stated clearly, the words echoing in the sudden silence of the dining room. "I am the founder and sole owner of Aegis Timber Works. We are an elite historic timber frame restoration firm. We specialize in the structural preservation and architectural resurrection of heritage properties." Evelyn gasped softly, reaching for her water glass with a trembling hand. Liam's smirk vanished completely. I kept my eyes locked on the Vances, continuing my factual report. "My company currently operates across 14 states. I oversee a full-time staff of over 280 master craftspeople, structural engineers, and preservation architects. We manage multi-million-dollar restoration contracts for federal heritage sites and private luxury developments." I paused, letting the metrics settle over the table like a heavy, irrefutable ledger. I didn't look at my parents to gauge their shock. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. The facade was shattered, crushed under the weight of empirical data. The transactional nature of my retaliation was clean and precise. I had just introduced my family to the CEO they had tried to bury. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, my hands perfectly steady. The ledger was updating in real time, and my family was rapidly approaching moral and social bankruptcy. The silence in the dining room stretched tight, brittle enough to snap. Evelyn's face had drained of all color, her foundation suddenly looking like a cheap mask. Arthur's mouth hung slightly open, his carefully constructed superiority dissolving into pure, unadulterated panic. But Margaret Vance wasn't finished. She set her napkin down with deliberate precision, her eyes locking onto my parents with a look of absolute disgust. "I am well aware of what Aegis Timber Works is," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the weight of a boardroom execution. 18 months ago, our corporate group awarded Aegis a $7.5 million historic district revitalization contract. It was one of the most complex architectural bids we have ever reviewed. Audrey spearheaded the entire operation. Her expertise saved the city's heritage sector. Liam choked on his drink, coughing into his napkin. Arthur gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Evelyn looked as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath her chair. "But that is not the only reason I recognized your name, Audrey," Margaret continued, her tone shifting from professional admiration to cold, lethal. "When my development group acquired this estate, we ran a deep forensic audit on the property titles. We uncovered a fascinating piece of history regarding the very carriage house we are dining in tonight." Margaret paused, letting the tension escalate. My parents seemed to shrink into their chairs, the air escaping their lungs. I watched them clinically, observing the rapid depreciation of their arrogance. "This carriage house," Margaret stated, her words slicing through the room, "was originally designed and built by Audrey's late biological father. It is a registered historic landmark." The room spun for a fraction of a second, but my mind instantly corrected its balance. My biological father, a man I had been told was a worthless drifter who had abandoned me before Evelyn met Arthur. The audit revealed a severe trail of financial fraud. Margaret delivered the final, crushing blow. Decades ago, Evelyn and Arthur illegally seized this property. They sold it off under fraudulent title deeds using forged signatures. In the process of liquidating Audrey's rightful inheritance, they also quietly pocketed a $1.5 million trust fund that her biological father had legally established solely for her care and education. The revelation hit the table with explosive force. I didn't gasp. I didn't break down. The betrayal didn't break my heart. It simply reorganized my data. They hadn't just marginalized me. They had financially exploited my existence. Every harsh word, every hand-me-down, every refusal to fund my education, it was all financed by the very money they had stolen from me. I looked at Evelyn, who was now trembling violently, and Arthur, who was staring blankly at his plate. The emotional accounting was finally complete. They hadn't treated me like a burden because I was worthless. They had treated me like a burden because looking at me reminded them of their own criminality. The truth was out, the forensic audit was permanently closed, and their massive, unforgivable debt had just come due in the most public forum imaginable. I sat perfectly still, radiating absolute control as their empire burned. Evelyn immediately resorted to her standard operational protocol: weaponized victimhood. She threw her hands up to her face, forcing out a jagged, theatrical sob. Tears pooled in her eyes as she looked frantically around the table, desperately trying to salvage her shattered equity. "This is a lie, a complete fabrication," Evelyn cried out, her voice shrill and trembling. "I sacrificed everything to raise this girl. We took her in. We fed her. We gave her the prestigious Telfair name. And this is how she repays us? By orchestrating this disgusting public humiliation? Audrey, how could you manipulate the Vances into attacking your own mother?" Liam, desperate to protect his own corporate reputation, jumped in. "Look, there must be a misunderstanding with the paperwork. My parents are upstanding citizens. Audrey has always been difficult, always trying to cause a scene to get attention. She probably fed you bad information." I didn't dignify their panic with a response. I sat motionless, watching their desperate attempts at damage control. But their audience wasn't buying the performance. Robert Vance slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. The sharp crack silenced Evelyn's fake sobs instantly. "Do not insult my intelligence, Liam," Robert said, his voice laced with pure disgust. He turned his glare to Arthur, who was cowering silently in his chair. "And Arthur, your spinelessness is truly pathetic. You sit there letting your wife and son lie through their teeth when we have the bank records and forged deeds locked in a safe. You are a coward and a thief." Before Arthur could stammer out a defense, a quiet, steady voice cut through the chaos. "Every word Margaret said is the absolute truth." Everyone turned toward the end of the table. Nana Clara sat straight in her wheelchair, her frail frame radiating ironclad dignity. She had been silent the entire evening, but now her eyes burned with fierce clarity. "I watched them do it," Nana Clara stated clearly, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I watched Evelyn and Arthur forge those documents. I watched them steal that $1.5 million trust fund from a grieving child. They threatened to lock me away in a care facility if I ever spoke a word of it to Audrey. I stayed silent to protect her, hoping one day she would be strong enough to survive the truth. And looking at her now, a master of her craft, I see she is more than strong enough." That was the breaking point. The undeniable confirmation from the family matriarch collapsed Evelyn's psychological scaffolding entirely. She let out a guttural, unhinged scream, a full public breakdown. She knocked over her wineglass, staining the white tablecloth a deep crimson, clutching her hair as her meticulously cultivated social standing vanished into thin air. Her wails echoed through the historic carriage house. I watched my mother unravel with total emotional detachment. I felt no pity, no remorse, and no sorrow. The liability had been fully liquidated. My family's toxic enterprise was bankrupt, exposed in front of the very elite society they worshipped. I didn't reach out to comfort Evelyn. I didn't offer Liam or Arthur a lifeline. I just sat there, breathing evenly, watching the architecture of their deception collapse into dust. It was a flawless, clinical execution. 4 months later, the dust had permanently settled. I stood in the center of my sunlit Charleston restoration studio, surrounded by the steady, focused hum of my team's productivity. The rich, earthy scent of fresh cedar wood shavings, aged oak, and linseed oil filled the vast open beam space. My lead project managers were gathered around a massive drafting table, carefully reviewing newly approved blueprints for a $22 million state preservation contract. I traced the intricate lines of the timber framing with my index finger, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of the corporate empire I had built with my own two hands. The Telfair family was no longer my concern. The legal notices regarding the fraudulent property seizure and the stolen $1.5 million trust fund had been dispatched swiftly and ruthlessly by my corporate attorneys. Criminal fraud investigations were currently underway, and my parents' financial assets were completely frozen pending a federal audit. Evelyn, Arthur, and Liam had been entirely cut off, their phone numbers blocked, their access to my life permanently revoked. Margaret Vance remained a steadfast professional ally, and our development firms were currently collaborating on 3 new major historic districts. Nana Clara was finally safe. I had moved her into a beautiful, privately staffed, assisted living suite overlooking the harbor, fully funded by Aegis Timberworks. We spoke on the phone every single Sunday, her voice strong and entirely free from fear. Looking out over my bustling studio, the cold, clinical precision of my retaliation began to slowly thaw into something much warmer and far more profound. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy anchor of their toxicity. But true freedom also requires the uncompromising courage to walk away and never look back. To anyone listening who has ever felt like they are standing on the extreme periphery of their own family, the black sheep, the outsider, the one whose greatest achievements are constantly minimized, sanitized, or mocked, I want you to hear this clearly and take it to heart. You are not invisible because you lack fundamental value. You are marginalized because your fierce, independent light deeply threatens their comfortable, heavily controlled darkness. Do not let people who operate in deep emotional deficits audit your self-worth. You do not have to shrink yourself, compromise your passions, or mute your voice to keep deeply insecure people comfortable. Your differences are not liabilities. They are your absolute greatest assets in this world. The pain of chronic invalidation is heavy, but the strength you forge while carrying it makes you unbreakable. The blueprint of your life belongs solely to you, and you have every right to build something magnificent out of the very materials they carelessly threw away. You don't have to keep begging for a seat at a toxic table where you are being deliberately starved. You have the power to stand up, walk out, and build your own table. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stop shrinking yourself to keep insecure people comfortable, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment about where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. See you in the next story.